So before I can actually make my cover, since I'm doing the inset, I have to create the space for the inset on one of my pieces of bookboard. I can decide where to place it, if I want it in the center, down in a corner, whatever I might opt for. And I'm going to go ahead and actually carve some space out of the board to allow for that. Now, the first thing I have to know is the dimension of my inset object. In this case, it's roughly 4 1/4 by 3 3/4. So I'm actually going to step up the space that I make here to be a little bit bigger. Some of this I think will hopefully be a little bit more obvious as we move along, but I have to not only make a space for this to sit, but there has to be space around it so that it can go down in there, otherwise it won't work. So I want to cut myself a guide that is a little bit bigger than that because I need the space on the cover to be wider and taller than the inset actually is. I'm going to go ahead and actually borrow some board from the back of this sketch pad. It's a great way to sort of use that material. These backs of sketch pads also make good bookboard most of the time. Some of them are a little thin, but most of the time they'll work pretty well. So I'm going to make my square, since it was 3 3/4 by 4 1/4, I'm going to make it 4 by 4 1/2. My 4-inch side, and now I'm going to go ahead and cut it to 4 1/2. Alright, so this, if you see, is a little bit bigger all the way around than the inset object itself. Now I'm going to use this to make the guides for the placement on the actual cover board. So in order to actually make the cutout for my inset, I need my guide, and I need to go ahead and start marking on my cover board. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've decided, you know, you can place this wherever you want. You could go down in the corner, you could go in the middle, way over here if you wanted to for some reason. I think for this one I'm going to go sort of in the middle, but over towards the edge, just centered between top and bottom. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a mark 1/2 inch in from the edge of the cover with my pencil. And that'll sort of be where the inset starts. I try most of the time not to let my insets get right up on the edge. You do want a border all the way around most of the time. And the closer you get to the edge, the weaker your board can get. So now that I've got that set up, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just sort of eyeball this. I'm going to center it between the top and the bottom, and then just trace around it with my pencil. And I'm using my 1/2 inch mark here as a straight edge to make sure that this is not at an angle or off center in any way that I don't want it to be. Okay, so now this is what I've got. This is what I'm going to use to make my inset. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to score along each of these lines that I've made just a couple times to get myself started. It's really key that you don't score it too deep because the goal here is not to cut through the board. The goal here is to remove some layers from the board. If you look at the corner of a piece of chipboard, you'll see, and in fact we'll just take this as an example, you'll see that it's actually layers and layers of paper put together. So the goal is really to strip away a few of those layers. Okay, so once I've got those started, I don't know if you can see it very well, but I've got a score mark on each of those lines that I've drawn. I'm just going to carefully work them a little bit deeper. One way to keep an eye on things and make sure that your cuts are not getting too deep is to flip your board over and look at the back of it. If you start to see little upraised bumps along the back where you were cutting, it's a sign that you're getting too close to cutting all the way through the board. Of course, anytime you're working with your X-Acto knife without your straight edge as a guard, you want to be very careful that you're not getting too close to your own fingers. Now, I've made those swirl marks decently deep, and I'm ready to start peeling away layers. So I'm going to use my X-Acto knife, sort of like a shovel, I guess, here, and get underneath, right at that corner where I had started to carve, a few layers of the bookboard. And I'm just going to peel it away. At some point it may tear, it may not peel evenly across yet. You can see it starts to tear there. So then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to take a look at this corner. I'm going to peel it out a little bit. And I'm going to do this until I have a fairly decent recess in the board. Working it from different corners, peeling away a layer or two at a time. I do want to try to keep my layers even, so if I notice that it's starting to look a little bumpy, I might work on the middle. Okay, once you've got that a decent way down, you can see I've probably peeled off 3, 4, maybe 5 layers of bookboard here, and just put that in a little trash pile. You'll be able to see, maybe not so well in this video, but there's a recess there, very clearly a recess, and if I take my piece of paper, I can very easily inset it into the cover. And I've got a little bit of space all the way around it, which I need for a couple of reasons. One, you don't want this pushing up right on the edge. It'll look a little bit messy. And I also need to make sure that I allow space for when I cover this with the cloth, because the cloth itself will take up space and could make that effect worse if you don't leave a little bit of extra edge all the way around. So now what we're ready to do is go ahead and construct the cover. So the next thing that we want to do is to cover our boards with the cloth. You should note that at this point you do have a front board and a back board. This is your front cover, this is your back cover, and so you'll want to be thinking about that when you're putting them down on the cloth, especially if you've chosen to put this maybe down in a corner, a lower corner, because if you get it the wrong way, you can still turn it up and flip it around and it'll be alright, but your box will not be where you had planned for it to be originally. So, thinking about it this way, if this is the way that a book opens and closes, I want my inset board to be the first one I put down. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this full cloth. It's really great because it's actually easier than doing quarter cloth to a certain extent. I'm going to go ahead and start by gluing up my board. Again, as always, I'm going to put a decent layer down. I don't want to go too crazy heavy, but I need enough that it'll stick. And I do want to put glue in that space where I've left for my inset, but I want to be a fairly light layer. If you put too much in there, it'll kind of bubble up and dry in lumps, and that can just be really annoying and create just kind of an ugly blemish on the cover of your book. So just enough in there to stick the cloth to it, but not enough to cause lumps. Okay, so now I've got a decent layer on there. I want to be careful. This is my spine edge, this is my foredge. So I'm going to lay this down on my cloth, pretty close over here to the edge, maybe about 1 inch, and leaving about 1 inch at the top and bottom. And I'm going to press it down really carefully. And then what I want to do is flip this over, take my bone folder, and really just press this down. Now, if you take a look at this right now, it just looks pretty much like a piece of board covered with cloth. You can sort of maybe see some things going on there. What I'm going to do is take my bone folder and really work the cloth into that space that I've created. If it bubbles a little bit, I'm just going to keep working it till it adheres. Really articulate the edges and the corners. And I'm also going to go ahead and just go around the edge of the board and articulate that as well. And now you should be able to see pretty well that there's that space there for the inset. It's actually created a lower level. And if I just, for the sake of experimentation, place this, it's looking pretty good size-wise. Definitely have some space all the way around it. I'm not quite ready for that yet, though. Now, you'll remember that on our other boards, we were always measuring over and marking an inch because we needed to put down the cloth spine layer first, and there was no real way to make sure that you did that with appropriate placement unless you make those marks. Now, because this is all full cloth, I don't have to do that step. Instead, I'm either going to, now knowing that I need to set up my spine gap, measure over ½ an inch and make a couple marks as my guide, or in my case, I'm just going to use my steel rule. This is ½ an inch wide, and I'm going to put it in between the two boards, and I'm going to put this ruler down here to help guide so that my placement along the bottom is even. And then I'm just going to glue up my other cover board. Decent layer of glue again, nothing crazy. Okay, and when I'm ready, I'm going to use my rule and my ruler as my guides to make sure I get this placed properly. And then I'm just going to press that down nice and tight. Pull out the rule and the ruler, flip this back over, and again, work the board down with my bone folder. Just want to make sure everything's getting nice and adhered where it ought to be. Just double check over here. All right, and so now we have our full cover cloth almost ready to go. We just need to trim and turn it in. So I'm going to trim just like I've done before. I'm going to start on the short edges. Got my 3/4 inch rule that I'm using as my guide. Do both of the short ends first. And you'll see that my rule is not quite long enough to go the full length, so I'm just going to have to sort of work carefully here. And scoot it down as I get a little further along. See the same thing happening on this side. My scraps. And now I'm going to go ahead and cut my corners at that roughly 45-degree angle, leaving about 1/8 of an inch between the corner of the board and where I make the cut. I'm going to do that all the way around. And now I'm ready to make my turn-ins.